It was a cold, dreary evening when I found myself on the lonely stretch of highway, the rain beating against my windshield like an unrelenting drum. I had been driving for hours, hoping to reach my destination before nightfall, but the darkness seemed to have arrived far too early. Tired, hungry, and with my gas tank nearly empty, I began to worry that I might have to spend the night in my car. But then, through the thick fog, I saw an old flickering neon sign that read Sunset Motel. The lights buzzed and flickered, but I could see the silhouette of the building through the mist. It seemed like the perfect place to stop for the night, even though the sign looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. With a sigh of relief, I pulled into the gravel parking lot. The motel was small and worn out, its white paint peeling and its windows cracked. The door of the office creaked as I entered. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman, her eyes narrow and watchful. Her hair was gray, tied back in a bun, and her skin sagged with age, but there was something sharp about her gaze that made me uncomfortable. "Room for the night?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yeah, just a single room. I'll take whatever you have available," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. She didn't say anything but grabbed a key from behind the counter and handed it to me. The number on the key was 13. "Room 13, down the hall, last door on the left." "You'll be fine," she said, her eyes still fixed on me as if studying my every move. I thanked her and made my way to the room. It was small but functional, one bed, a rickety old chair, a desk, and a bathroom. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floor creaked underfoot. But at that point I didn't care. I was too tired to worry about anything else. I locked the door behind me, collapsed onto the bed, and tried to fall asleep. But the room was eerily quiet, except for the occasional sound of wind tapping against the window. Just as I began to drift off, I heard a faint knocking on the door. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then it came again, soft, slow, and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. My heart raced. I wasn't expecting anyone. I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. Cautiously, I got up and peered through the peephole. There was no one outside. I opened the door slowly, stepping into the hallway. The dim lights flickered above me, casting long shadows down the corridor. The motel felt even more abandoned now, as if the walls were hiding secrets. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and pushed the dresser in front of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but exhaustion won over, and I eventually fell into a restless sleep. The night passed in a blur of strange dreams, visions of dark hallways and whispers in the walls. When I woke up, the sun had barely risen, and I could feel the weight of something heavy in the air, like the motel itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But something was wrong. Something was definitely wrong. I decided to leave. But as I grabbed my bags and walked to the door, I noticed something strange. The door handle was covered in scratches, small jagged marks, as if someone or something had been trying to get in. My heart pounded, and I quickly backed away, dropping my bag in the process. I stood frozen in place, my breath shallow. My mind raced with questions. Was this just the result of years of neglect, or was something more sinister at play? The knock came again, this time louder, more forceful. I ran to the window, hoping to see something, anything, that would explain this strange feeling. But the outside world was just as foggy and obscured as before. I had to leave, but the door, the key, everything felt like it was keeping me here. I took a deep breath and tried to steady my nerves. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps it was just the isolation getting to me, the stillness of the place making my mind play tricks. But something in my gut told me I wasn't just imagining things. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone was pounding on the door. I couldn't just stand there. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I hesitated, unsure of what to do. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door. I couldn't get out of this room fast enough. But as I reached for the handle, I heard a voice, a low guttural whisper that came from the other side of the door. "Leave, now." I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't the elderly woman from the office, nor anyone I had seen before. The voice felt ancient, like it belonged to something far older than any person I could imagine. My heart pounded in my chest. Without thinking, I threw the door open. There was no one there. Only the dark, empty hallway stretching out before me like a tunnel into the unknown. The air was thick, as if something unseen was pressing down on me, forcing me back into the room. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There had been no one outside, no one to speak. But the voice, it was real. I could still feel the echo of it in my ears. I turned to look at the small window in the corner of the room, hoping the daylight would provide some clarity. But the fog outside had only thickened. The world felt suffocating. I sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to gather my thoughts. What was going on? Why was I still here? Why did the woman in the office give me room 13? Why was everything about this motel so off? The answer came to me in a flash. Room 13. I had seen that number before. It was always bad luck, the unlucky number. But this wasn't about superstition. There was something more to this room. It was like the room itself was, alive, waiting. I stood up, pacing around the room, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. Every crack in the walls, every squeak of the floorboards seemed to whisper something to me, something I couldn't quite hear. Suddenly, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a soft tapping, not from the door this time, but from the wall. Slowly, I turned toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the corner of the room, near the closet. I took a cautious step toward it, my legs shaky with fear. The closer I got, the more the tapping intensified. It sounded almost like someone was knocking from the other side of the wall, but there was nothing there, just the peeling wallpaper and the cracked plaster. I reached out and touched the wall. It was cold, unnaturally cold. A shiver ran down my spine. The tapping stopped as soon as my fingers made contact with the surface. I pulled my hand away quickly, but before I could react, the room shifted. The air grew thick, and the floor beneath me seemed to tremble. I heard a deep guttural sound, like something was stirring beneath the motel. A low growl, distant but unmistakable. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. This place, this room was cursed, but the door was locked. The key was in my pocket, the only thing that connected me to the outside world. But what if I couldn't leave? What if the motel itself was trapping me here? I rushed to the window, but the fog outside had turned into a dense, swirling mist. I could barely see anything. It was as if the world had disappeared altogether. My breathing grew shallow as panic set in. I was alone, trapped in a room that didn't want me to leave. Then I heard it again, the voice. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, like it was coming from inside the room, echoing off the walls. Don't leave. You belong here. I spun around, my heart racing. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the motel was alive. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen in place, as if some invisible force had its grip on me. Suddenly, the door swung open by itself, revealing the dark hallway beyond. But it wasn't the hallway I had seen before. This one was different, darker, twisted. The walls were covered in shadows that seemed to move on their own, reaching toward me. I could feel the pull of the hallway, as if it were calling me, pulling me in. The voice was stronger now, whispering in my ear, "Come with us, you are ours." I tried to resist, but the air grew heavier with each passing second. My legs moved of their own accord, carrying me toward the open door. My mind screamed for me to stop, but it was like my body was no longer mine to control. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The flickering lights cast strange, elongated shadows on the walls. As I walked down the corridor, I could hear the faint sound of something scraping, like nails dragging across the floor. I turned a corner and saw a door at the end of the hall. It was old, its wood rotting, the handle rusted and broken. But the voice was louder now, coming from the other side of the door. "Open it. You know what's inside." I knew I should turn back. I knew I should run, but my hand reached out toward the door, and I turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It was filled with dust and cobwebs, but there was something more. A strange symbol etched into the floor, glowing faintly in the darkness. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat as I saw it. In the center of the room, standing in the circle of symbols, was the figure of a woman. Her face was pale and twisted, her eyes black as coal. She was staring at me, her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. I tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. "You shouldn't have come," the woman whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I felt the temperature drop, the air turning cold and thick with dread. I realized with a sickening certainty that this was no ordinary motel. It was a place for the lost, a place where souls were trapped, never to escape. And I was about to be one of them. I was trapped. There was no way out. The woman in the center of the room grinned wider, her black eyes never leaving mine. The shadows around her seemed to shift, as if the walls themselves were alive, pulling me in. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with the horror of the situation. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, frozen in place by the sheer terror that gripped me. "Don't be afraid," the woman whispered, her voice sending a cold shiver down my spine. "You are not the first to wander into this place, and you won't be the last." I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if something was holding me in place. Something powerful, something ancient. I could feel it crawling under my skin, in my veins, wrapping around my heart. The air was thick with dread, suffocating me. The symbols on the floor pulsed with a sickly green. I stared at them, feeling a magnetic pull toward the center of the room, where the woman stood. But I couldn't let myself get closer. I fought against the invisible force, trying with all my strength to break free, but it was no use. The pull was too strong. My feet dragged across the dusty floor as I unwillingly moved closer to the center of the room. Suddenly, I saw a flash of movement in the corner of the room. A shadow darted across the walls, too quick for my eyes to follow. I gasped, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was no longer alone. The shadows in the room had come alive, swirling and shifting, growing, taking on forms, figures that were once human, trapped and twisted by whatever dark force had taken hold of this place. A figure stepped out from the shadows, its face gaunt and hollow, its eyes sunken and empty. It was a man, no, once a man, but now nothing more than a hollow shell of a person, bound to this cursed motel. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, a low, mournful moan echoed through the room. His skin was covered in pale, rotting sores, and his hands were outstretched, reaching for me, yearning for the same fate. "Help me," he whispered, his voice weak and broken. "Don't stay. It's too late for us, but not for you." His words barely registered as my mind raced, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the weight of the curse that bound this place, that held everyone who dared enter. This was no ordinary motel. It was a prison for the lost, a trap for anyone foolish enough to wander in. And now, I was one of them. The woman's voice rang out again, sharp and commanding. "Join us. Join the others who are trapped in this place. You cannot escape." I felt the world closing in on me. The walls seemed to bend, warping into something darker, something monstrous. The shadows reached out for me, wrapping around my legs, pulling me toward the center of the room. But then, through the haze of fear and desperation, a thought broke through. The door. The door was still open. With what little strength I had left, I forced myself to turn, stumbling toward the doorway. The shadows clawed at my feet, pulling me back, but I fought against them with everything I had. My heart raced as I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grasped the handle. But just before I could pull it open, the woman's voice echoed once more. "You cannot leave. This place is your fate now." I wrenched the door open with a final burst of strength, throwing myself into the hallway. The walls were closing in, the shadows chasing after me, but I didn't stop. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I had to get out. The motel seemed to stretch on endlessly, the hallways twisting and turning, leading me deeper into the labyrinth of rooms. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to escape. I finally reached the front door, my breath ragged, my body drenched in sweat. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow, heavy, dragging, as if something was following. I slammed my hand against the door, desperate to escape. The lock clicked, and I yanked the door open. Outside, the fog was thick, almost suffocating. The world was silent, empty. The motel behind me loomed like a dark silhouette, its windows black and hollow, watching me. The air was still, but I could feel the presence of something lurking, something waiting. I didn't look back. I ran, not stopping until the motel was far behind me, swallowed by the mist. I don't know how I made it out, but I did, and I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest town, where I collapsed, exhausted, in the first diner I could find. The waitress asked me what had happened, why I looked so pale, but I couldn't answer. How could I explain the horrors I'd seen? How could I explain the curse of the Sunset Motel? As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A newspaper, left on the counter, with a headline that sent a chill through my spine. Sunset Motel, owner found dead after mysterious disappearances. Beneath the headline was a photo of the elderly woman I had met when I checked in. Her face was pale, lifeless, and in the background of the photo, I could see the faint outline of a figure, a man, or perhaps a shadow, standing in the doorway of the motel. The story was old, years old, but it didn't matter. I had seen her, and I had seen the others. I had heard the whispers, the calls to join them, and I knew, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that the Sunset Motel would never truly leave me. I would always carry its curse, its secrets, with me. It was late when I pulled into the parking lot of the rundown motel. The neon sign flickered weakly above, casting an eerie red glow over the empty space. The air was thick with humidity, and the night was quieter than I had ever experienced. No crickets, no distant hum of traffic, just silence. I had been driving for hours, and I was desperate for sleep. I didn't expect much from the place, just a bed for the night. But as I parked my car and walked up to the front office, something felt off. The building was old, almost abandoned looking. The lights inside the office were dim, and I could barely see the shadow of a person behind the counter. "Hello?" I called, knocking softly on the window. The shadow shifted, and an elderly woman appeared. She had a thin face, her features sharp and weathered. Her eyes were wide and unblinking. "Yes?" she rasped. "I need a room for the night," I said, trying to ignore the discomfort creeping up my spine. "Of course. We have a vacancy," she said with a strange, unsettling smile. "Room 8. It's just down the hall." I nodded, unsure if I should press for more details, but I was too tired to care. She handed me a rusty key, its brass surface scratched and tarnished. "Thanks," I said, glancing at the sign again. "Is this place safe?" Her smile faltered just for a second, but she quickly recovered. "It's perfectly fine," she said, her voice too sweet. "No one bothers you here. You can rest." I nodded again, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Room 8 was at the end of the hallway. The door creaked as I opened it, and I stepped inside, shivering slightly from the cold air. The room was small, with yellowed wallpaper and a single bed covered with a faded floral duvet. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, revealing cracked tiles and a sink that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I locked the door behind me and tossed my bag on the bed. As I sat down, I glanced around the room. It seemed so lonely. Nothing felt right. The air smelled stale, like old wood and dust. My eyes caught sight of something strange, a small black and white photograph on the nightstand. It showed the very motel, taken many years ago, but the picture was unsettling. The place looked much newer in the photo, and the faces of the people standing in front of the building were blurred. But there was one thing that stood out. The eyes of the people in the photo seemed wrong. They were dark, empty, like they were staring right into me. I shivered again and quickly placed the photo face down. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was too tired. I took a quick shower and tried to shake off the strange feeling that was creeping over me. I climbed into bed trying to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel something watching me. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the hallway. I froze, heart pounding. My mind raced. Was someone outside my door? The silence that followed was unbearable. I slowly got out of bed and approached the door. My hand hovered over the handle, but something inside me told me not to open it. I backed away, my pulse racing. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, more intense. Then, just as I was about to crawl back into bed, there was a knock at the door. A soft, rhythmic knock that made my heart skip a beat. I froze. Who could be knocking at this hour? I tried to ignore it, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. It kept knocking, louder and louder, until it was no longer a knock, but a violent banging. I jumped back, fear gripping me. Should I answer, or should I just stay silent? Before I could make up my mind, the door opened on its own. The sound of the hinges creaking echoed in the small room, but no one was standing there, just darkness. I turned around, ready to run, but something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, a figure stood, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, too tall, and its face was pale, almost ghostly. The figure didn't move, just watched me. My breath caught in my throat. My body froze in terror. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my bag and rushed to the door, but as soon as I touched the handle, it slammed shut, trapping me inside. The figure moved closer, its eyes glowing red in the dark. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was so close now, and I could feel its cold presence filling the room. Then suddenly the lights flickered and went out. I could hear my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as the darkness seemed to swallow the room. My heart was racing, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled for my phone in my bag. The faint glow of the screen was the only source of light in the pitch-black room, but it felt like it was barely enough to keep the shadows at bay. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I could feel it drawing closer, its eyes, those glowing, unnatural eyes, never leaving me. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, but the fear was paralyzing. What was this thing? Why was it here? I held my phone out in front of me, the weak light casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I couldn't look away from the figure. I didn't even know if it was real or if I was hallucinating from exhaustion, but everything about it felt wrong. Its face was pale, almost translucent, and its features seemed to shift, like they were trying to rearrange themselves into something more human. A cold gust of air swept through the room, making me shiver. The figure didn't seem to be affected by the temperature, remaining motionless as I tried to back away, inch by agonizing inch. The sound of my own breathing was deafening in the silence, and then, in the dead stillness, it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The voice was soft, like the rustle of dry leaves, but there was a chilling undertone to it that sent a shockwave of fear straight through me. My stomach twisted in knots as I tried to speak, to scream, but my throat was dry, and no words came out. "Why?" I managed to choke out. "You don't belong here," it repeated, its voice now more forceful, though still barely audible. "No one belongs here." I glanced toward the door, my last hope of escape. The handle was cold to the touch, and I twisted it frantically, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was getting closer, moving silently through the shadows. It was as though the darkness itself was its ally, concealing its movements until it was right next to me. My panic surged. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. Its eyes glowed brighter, turning an unnatural shade of red. "To make you one of us," it answered, the words lingering in the air like a poisonous mist. The room seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping to a level that made my breath visible in the air. I could feel my fingers going numb, my body fighting against the chill. The figure was inches from me now, and I could see the faint outline of its face, distorted and almost inhuman. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't alive. It was something else. something that didn't belong in this world. Please, audible, I don't want to be here, I just need to leave. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it tilted its head, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. It was studying me, as though deciding something. For a moment, everything was still. No sound, no movement. Just the oppressive weight of the air around us. And then, as if it had made a decision, the figure spoke again. "You will stay." The room grew even colder, and suddenly, the lights flickered back on. For a split second, I saw it, really saw it, in full clarity. Its face was gaunt, hollow, with black holes where its eyes should have been. The skin stretched tight over its skull, and its lips were curled into a grotesque smile. The smile wasn't kind, but cruel, like it enjoyed my fear. "Get out of here," I shouted, my voice full of desperation. I didn't know if it could hear me or if it was just to comfort myself, but I had to try. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. I stood there, frozen in place, the silence pressing down on me. My body shook, but I didn't dare move. What just happened? Was it real? I wasn't sure, but I couldn't take the chance. I grabbed my things and ran toward the door again, my mind racing. The handle turned this time, but it felt stiff, like something was holding it back. Finally opened, but not into the hallway. Instead, there was only darkness, thick, inky blackness that stretched beyond the frame, as though the hallway itself had disappeared. No way was I stepping into that. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard miles away. I couldn't just sit here and wait for whatever that thing was to come back. I had to leave, right now. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was dead. No bars, no Wi-Fi, nothing. My mind raced as I scrambled to think of something, anything. I needed help. I needed to escape. The photo on the nightstand flashed into my memory. The blurry faces, the eyes that weren't right. Could this motel be connected to whatever was happening? Was it the place that was cursed, or was it the people who stayed here? I had to know. I ran out of the room back into the hallway, but the air felt thick now, like it was closing in on me. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to find the exit. I had to get out before it was too late. The walls seemed to shift around me, the hallway stretching longer with each step. The door to the office at the end of the hall seemed miles away, even though I hadn't moved very far. My breathing became ragged, my pulse throbbing in my ears. The sense of being followed, of being watched, grew stronger with each step. I looked over my shoulder and saw something that made my stomach drop, an outline of a figure at the far end of the hallway. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but I could see the faint outline of the same shape that had appeared in my room. The tall, shadowy figure. It was moving toward me. I was running now, my feet pounding on the old carpet, but it was as if the hallway was never ending. No matter how fast I moved, the figure was always there, just out of reach. Finally, I reached the office. I threw open the door without knocking, but the room was empty. No one was behind the counter. No one was in sight. The same woman who had checked me in was... The whole room was empty, as if no one had ever been there at all. My stomach twisted in fear. What was happening? Where had everyone gone? And then, from behind me, I heard a low voice. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the hallway was empty. There was no one behind me. Nothing. Just silence. My breath came out in shaky gasps, and for a moment, I wondered if I had lost my mind. But then I heard it again. "You can't leave." It wasn't coming from behind me this time. It was coming from inside the room. I turned back to the office, my blood turning cold. Standing behind the counter, the elderly woman who had checked me in was there. Her smile was stretched unnaturally wide now, her face twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. She looked wrong. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, black as night, and they gleamed with a malevolent light. The wrinkles on her face deepened, like the skin was sagging off her bones. The thinness of her lips curled into something that resembled an almost toothless grin. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. "You've been chosen," she said, her voice raspy, the words dripping like honey from her lips. "Now you belong to the motel." Her words echoed in my ears, and suddenly I understood. I wasn't just trapped in the motel. I was part of it. I had stepped into something far worse than I could have imagined. This place wasn't just old and haunted. It was a trap, a prison for the souls of those who stayed too long. And now, I was one of them. I tried to turn and run, but the hallway stretched farther than it ever had before. The door to the outside was gone, replaced by endless walls of darkness. The air became thick, suffocating, and no matter how hard I fought, I couldn't move. "Let me go," I screamed, my voice barely a whisper against the weight of the silence. The woman's grin grew wider. "You never left, dear. No one leaves this place." Suddenly, the world around me seemed to collapse. The walls twisted, the floor buckled beneath my feet, and the air was filled with the sound of whispered voices, voices of those who had stayed here before me. They echoed through the darkness, their cries of terror and desperation mingling with the sinister whispers of the motel. I felt myself sinking, my body becoming weightless. The walls closed in around me, and everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying in the bed again, the room silent. The bedspread was still the same faded floral pattern, and the air smelled just as stale as before. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I saw the photo on the nightstand again. The same black and white picture of the motel, the faces blurred, the eyes dark and empty. My reflection in the glass of the window caught my eye. My face was pale, my eyes wide, as though I had seen something that shouldn't be real. But when I looked closer, I saw it, just behind my reflection, the faint outline of someone standing in the corner of the room, the same figure, the same glowing red eyes. I didn't need to look around to know what had happened. I was no longer alone, and I wasn't leaving. The door slammed shut behind me. There was no escaping now. It was a cold, dark evening when I found myself on the side of a lonely highway. My car had broken down miles from the nearest town, and with no cell service and no other cars in sight, I had no choice but to walk. The wind bit at my skin, making me wish I had packed a jacket instead of the light sweater I was wearing. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, I saw a flickering neon sign in the distance, "Midnight Motel." It seemed like a mirage at first, but as I got closer, I realized it was real. The sign was old and cracked, casting an eerie red glow over the empty parking lot. There was no one around, and the motel itself looked worn down and abandoned, like something out of a nightmare. I hesitated, wondering if I should just keep walking, but the thought of finding shelter, even if it was just for the night, made me push forward. I walked into the office, the door creaking as it opened. The smell of old wood and stale air hit me instantly. Behind the counter sat a man, strange-looking, almost as if he hadn't moved in years. He didn't greet me with a smile but simply nodded, his eyes not leaving mine. "Need a room?" he asked, in a voice that sounded like it came from a place far. "Yes," I replied, my voice shaky. "My car broke down, and I just need a place to stay for the night." The man handed me a key without a word. It was an old brass key with a number tag, room 13. As I walked to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The motel felt like it was stuck in time, with faded wallpaper, dusty windows, and a quiet that felt suffocating. When I reached my room, I turned the key in the lock and stepped inside. The room was small and dimly lit. A single bed covered in a thin, itchy blanket sat against one wall. There was a dresser, an old TV with no remote, and a small table. The curtains were drawn shut, and the air felt thick, like something had been trapped in here for a long time. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down, feeling both relieved and uneasy. The stillness of the motel made it feel like no one had been there in years. I locked the door and sat in silence, hoping for the night to pass quickly. But as the hours dragged on, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just a soft knocking sound coming from the walls. I thought it was the wind, but it didn't stop. The knocking came again, a slow and rhythmic tapping that seemed to get louder the longer I listened. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtains to see if anyone was outside, but there was nothing. No cars, no people, just darkness. I sat back down, my heart racing. The knocking continued, almost as if it was coming from inside the room itself. Then I heard something else, soft, muffled whispers, like voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. They were faint at first, but they grew louder and more distinct, echoing through the room. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the whispers grew more insistent, and I could no longer pretend I didn't hear them. I turned on the TV to drown out the noise, but the screen flickered, and static filled the room. That's when I noticed something strange. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move. At first, I thought it was just the poor lighting playing tricks on my eyes, but no matter how much I squinted or rubbed my eyes, the shadows shifted like they had a life of their own. Into growls, low and threatening. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my bag and tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside. Panicking, I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried the window next, but it was stuck, as if someone had sealed it shut. I felt trapped. The air in the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward me, their forms becoming more defined. I could see figures now, tall, thin, and hunched, their faces obscured in the darkness. They whispered my name, their voices hissing in my ear. I didn't know what to do. I could hear the footsteps of the figures moving closer, their presence growing stronger. I stumbled backward, tripping over the bed and falling to the floor. The whispers became louder, their voices now screams that filled my ears. Suddenly, the door to the room burst open with a loud crash, and I looked up to see the man from the office standing in the doorway. His eyes were wide, his face pale, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have stayed here," he said, his voice low and hollow. "You're one of them now." Before I could respond, the figures in the room lunged at me, their hands cold as they grabbed me, pulling me into the darkness. The figures loomed over me, their cold hands clutching my arms, pulling me toward them with unnatural strength. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. The room seemed to warp and twist, the walls bending and closing in as if they were alive. The air was thick, suffocating, and every breath felt like I was drowning in it. The man from the office stepped into the room, his eyes now glowing with an eerie light. "You're too late," he muttered. "They've already chosen you. There's no escaping now." I struggled, my body thrashing against the creatures that held me, but their grip only tightened. The whispers around me became a cacophony of unintelligible voices, all shouting, all demanding something. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel their hunger, their desire for me. I felt my strength slipping away as the shadows enveloped me completely. My vision blurred, my head spinning, and for a moment, I thought I might lose consciousness. But then, through the fog of panic and fear, I saw something. A faint light. Far in the distance, it was coming from the door that had just burst open. Through the figures that surrounded me, through the shadows, I saw a woman standing in the doorway. Her hair was wild, her face pale, but there was a sense of urgency in her eyes. She reached out toward me, whispered, her voice breaking the maddening screams. "It's not too late. You can still escape." I didn't question it. With every ounce of strength I had left, I broke free from the creatures holding me and sprinted toward the door. But just as I reached the threshold, the man from the office lunged, grabbing my arm. His fingers dug into my skin like claws trying to drag me back into the darkness. I fought back, kicking, punching, anything to break free from his grip. And then, with one final push, I broke free. I ran into the light, out of the room, and into the cold night air. As I turned back to look at the motel, I saw the figures watching me from the windows, their eyes glowing red. The man in the office stood in the doorway, but he didn't follow. His expression was one of defeat, and for a brief moment, I felt a strange pity for him. Then the shadows swallowed him whole, and he was gone. I didn't stop running. I didn't look back. My feet carried me down the highway, my heart pounding in my chest. The motel was behind me now, but the feeling of dread lingered, a heavy weight on my shoulders. It was hours before I reached the nearest town, but I didn't care about time anymore. I found a small diner and collapsed into a booth, drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. I ordered a coffee, trying to calm my nerves, but the waitress eyed me strangely, her gaze lingering on my pale face. "You all right?" she asked, her voice cautious. I nodded, but I wasn't sure if I would ever be all right again. The motel. I knew it was still there, waiting for its next victim. It was a place that existed outside of time, a place where shadows thrived, and souls were trapped forever. I couldn't help but wonder how many others had stayed there before me, how many had never left. I finished my coffee and stood up to leave, but as I walked out the door, something caught my eye. It was a newspaper on the counter, and the headline sent a chill down my spine. "Local motel goes missing. No one can remember it ever existing." I froze. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just read. Was I the only one who had been there? Was it possible that the motel had never been real? Had I imagined everything? The knocking, the whispers, the shadows. I glanced at the waitress one last time, but she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring at the door, her face pale. I followed her gaze, and my blood ran cold when I saw the reflection in the glass. In the reflection, I saw myself, but I was no longer alone. Behind me stood the figures, their glowing eyes staring at me from the shadows. And then, they smiled.